Welcome to Relish Books. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Laura Ingalls Wilder as a writer, more than talking about her actual work, which I feel like everyone is pretty familiar with, the children's classics, the Little House books, something that I read a lot growing up, and as a child, I think they were stories, they're told simply. And I didn't realize until I started reading them a little older how good her writing actually is, just as an author. Because I always read them with the mindset of, oh, she's telling the stories of her childhood. And maybe I didn't really think of her so much as an author in her own right, like with a creative mind. But when you look at her use of language, her descriptions, her conversation, like her dialogue, a lot of which is not straight from real life, I believe. I think it was largely embellished and shifted and changed to make the characters work better together, to make events flow better. I think she was a tremendous author, just on her own. So the first book was published in 1932, and then the last in 1943, of the ones that she published when she was alive. And she was born in 1867 and died in 1957. So she was 90 years old. So she had a very long, very full life. So much happening in it. I have read that she started writing the Little House books when she kind of looked at America, looked at where she was as an older woman, and kind of felt like the pioneer life and settlers were being forgotten, and people didn't really know anymore what it had been like. And so that's kind of how she started. But she doesn't start with their family moving. She starts, of course, in her first home, in the little house in the big woods. And the first one's so much fun. It's so cozy, and the girls are very little, and they have just these everyday things that they're excited about, and that tone kind of stays throughout the books. One of the things that I love watching is how the family kind of always stays the same. And they always have this firm foundation, even when you realize from things that are going on, even when Laura doesn't really address it. Sometimes that their family is doing pretty well, and then sometimes that they are poor to the point of desperation and starvation. But they don't really, there's this trust in their parents, and they don't really feel the desperation of those times. They still have a good life through it all. Something that I think really demonstrates how Laura is such an amazing writer is in Farmer Boy, because of course this is the book that's from the perspective of her husband's childhood, which of course she wasn't there for, and the choices that she makes in telling the stories that would have been told by him, and of course we don't know how good of a storyteller he was, and the choices she makes with characters, because there are certain of his siblings that she doesn't put in the story. So just her choices there are interesting, and her vast development of character. So all through the Laura books, it's her family, and there's such subtlety of character. But you could be well, it's her family. She knows how to write about her family. But then you look at Almanzo's family in Farmer Boy, and it's a totally different dynamic. So he also has a very happy childhood. It's a very stark contrast between Laura's family, who are often so poor and have very, very little, versus Almanzo's family, who grew up on a very prosperous farm. There's always plenty. She really takes time, it feels like, to describe. Her descriptions of food are poignant in all of the books, but it feels like she really takes extra time to describe each meal and just how much food there was, and as this contrast to her own childhood, where they had very little a lot of the time. But it's really fun. I feel like it's a lot of people's favorite. Farmer Boy is. It's not my favorite just because there's more, you spend so much more time with the other characters in Laura's story. But it is one of the most fun. It's just a really, it's really great, and it also seems to fit, even though it has nothing to do with it, it also fits well into the rest of the books. But what I love to think about with her as an author is that in her family she has these dynamics. We know all of the characters, we know how they work together, and the books largely revolve around Laura's relationship with her father. There's this very special connection between Laura and Pa that is demonstrated over the course of the series. From book one to the end, there's this clear feeling, and she writes about it so well. And then, of course, there's the mother, who is, I think, everybody's least favorite character. And Laura has this way of writing about her that's, it feels really clever. It feels almost sly a little bit, where she writes about her as if, of course, she's right because she's the mother, and of course, she's wise. And yet, there's this faint, like, knowing, like, you know how Laura really feels about her mother, and I'm sure she, loves her and everything, but Ma is kind of from a different time than Laura. She's very prim and proper, and everything must be exactly this way just because it's always been this way. And Laura is independent and fiery, and so there's this kind of tension. But Laura always writes as if, she's in the wrong and Ma's in the right. But you kind of have this feeling like this just this little perspective, just in the way that she writes about her, the conversations, you kind of get Laura's true feeling coming through. And I think that really affects how you feel about the characters. And just little bits and pieces here and there. One of the things that is a big deal in the books is Laura's kind of, not her rivalry, but envy of her older sister, who always seems like she's everyone's favorite, except for Pa. Laura's kind of the favorite there. She's so good. She always does everything right. She's so pretty. This big thing is like, Mary, the older sister, has blonde hair and Laura has brown hair, and that's kind of this recurring thing that just annoys her through the whole series. And there will be things like where Ma kind of plays into that. At one point, I think it's in the very first book, she sends the girls out to meet a relative, and she tells them to, like, ask her which she prefers, like blonde or brown hair, kind of just feeding this envy, and kind of just that she's a pretty materialistic person, and isn't always the best parent. And this kind of little bit of tension, not really tension, but just this difference plays into the stories. How, the parents have their disagreements, but Pa has these things that he really wants to do, but he's always kind of held back because Ma doesn't want to do them. But then in the end, he'll do them anyway because he is always wanting to move west. Ma never wants to move west. And Laura is always on Pa's side in all these things. She always wants to move. So just all these character dynamics that you have, the dynamics between Pa and then her Ma and then the sisters. There's these very established things that she would have grown up with, And then you have Farmer Boy, where it's totally different. He also has a very good, loving family environment, and the book also largely revolves around kind of the father and son relationship. But this father is so different from Pa, just this totally different character and type of father. He's a little more distant almost. Not that he's not involved, but he's more dignified. He's a little more someone to be have this healthy like respect and fear of than to have like I don't know, a strong closeness with. And yet he's still kind of the central influence in Almanzo's life, and Almanzo wants to live up to his standards. And yeah, so just the family dynamics are super interesting. You also, Laura doesn't have any brothers in her books, and so then we get like the brother dynamic in Farmer Boy, and just how brothers interact with their sisters, and all of that is so well done, and that's something that she didn't have experience with. So I think that that really shows her talents, and just again in the descriptions of this place that she didn't grow up with. And I think that a large part of that must have been a lot of imagination on her part as well. So just reading them again, like from an older perspective, and just appreciating all the things that I appreciated as a child, but all these new layers of her as an author. I think it's also interesting to think about, like, we can't really know what it was exactly like because she is changing a lot of things, but she has this talent of writing from the perspective that I kind of mentioned before, where she kind of puts herself down, but she does it in such a way that you're always on her side and you always feel like, oh, she's right. And she does the same thing in Farmer Boy. You feel the same thing with Almanzo. And it's like she has this, she's impetuous, and sometimes she like doesn't think before she does things, but in everything she does, and like when she gets in trouble and stuff, most of the time you're always like, you feel bad for her and you're on her side. And you know, these restricting things that she has in her life, things that she would like to do, yet you just always feel like you're on her side. But reading, that's from her perspective, and I think she does it really well. Kind of this mix of ego, where obviously she is the central character and you're always on her side, but also humility, and or not so much humility, but just like a reality of what things were really like. And that's really how it feels when you read the books. But it is very interesting to read. I haven't a whole lot, but to read some of her daughter's writings. And I will say here too that I don't like the first 4 years very much. The last book in this series. For one thing, it's more of a diary, and it was not to the point yet where Laura would have wanted it to be published. If my understanding's correct, it's written pretty differently from all the others. It's a lot more stark. It doesn't have the color and life that the others do. It's kind of just, it's a lot more factual without the a lot of heart behind it. And one of the saddest things to me in Laura's whole story is the way that she writes about her daughter and the birth of her daughter. It is, and I know that Laura, there's other things that show, Laura loved her, but there's this very cold and factual approach to it, and you really get the feeling that she didn't want a child very much, at least not at that time. The way that she writes about finding out that she's pregnant, and then the birth, and then the way that she writes about her for the rest of the book, it doesn't feel very motherly at all. She has a very kind of distant approach to her that is really sad to read about. And like I said, there are moments when you see that she does care about her, but just that coldness. And then when you read some of Rose's writings about growing up with Laura, you kind of see this different side. And yes, Laura was her mom, and I think people can judge their mothers a little more harshly than like other people would, because they're like right there in the situation. But you see how Laura's like high spirits and fieriness that is so fun in her books is not as good a thing in her like married life, in her family life. She is very snappy and very quick to anger, both with Rose and Almanzo. she's good too, of course. But I think sometimes she's so independent and she plays up her independence and her like philosophy of like she can do anything and she wants to do things her way. And sometimes I think when people are like that, they forget that other people can be allowed to feel that way too. And so she kind of has this like, since I want to do what I want to do, you must be wrong type mentality sometimes. There's this one little part I read in Rose's writings about how she'd be like washing dishes or putting the dishes away, and Laura would always tell her, don't break them. Like every time she'd be like, don't break that. When Rose had never broken a dish in her life. And there's just this little note of that, and you kind of get this feeling that this kind of summarizes how their relationship was. And so I think that's a good, like, if you're interested in like the real, Laura Ingalls, some of her later writings, more diary type writings, and then the writings of Rose can shed some light on that. But they don't have that, again, that novel form and that literary style and polish that I so appreciate in the Laura books, which I think really qualify as novels, not so much like memoir or anything like that. They are very good in a literary sense on their own. Um, I think they're great to read to kids, with your kids, then as a child, but also if you haven't read them before, they're great to read as an adult. And I am excited to read them more and excited to read them with my kids someday. So that's just a little bit of my thoughts of Laura Ingalls as a writer as well as a storyteller. Thanks.